at a time.
It's the facts.
One at a time.
It's the facts. It's the facts.
It's not a rumor, it's a fact. Kendrick Perkins just unmasked Stephen A. Smith for a secret campaign to have him removed from ESPN. But the deception runs much deeper. Perkins has pulled back the curtain on a pattern of behavior that threatens to shatter the public image of ESPN's top star. Here's the breakdown. It all started with a phone call, one that Kendrick Perkins says is seared into his memory forever. Not for bringing good news or a promise of riches, but for revealing the man Stephen A. Smith truly is, after the cameras stop rolling and the studio lights fade to black. What the public never saw was that Stephen A. Smith, the very man who shared the First Take desk with Kendrick Perkins, day in and day out sharing smiles and laughs, acting the part of a colleague and friend, was simultaneously maneuvering behind the scenes to engineer Perkins' complete ousting from the network. And the most chilling part? He nearly succeeded. If not for a single fateful conversation Perkins had with a top ESPN executive, a discussion that was never meant to reach his ears, the truth might have stayed buried forever. But to grasp the weight of that moment, you must first understand the depth of this rivalry. The saga of Kendrick Perkins and Stephen A. Smith isn't merely about two commentators at odds. It's a narrative about influence. It's a narrative about dominance. And above all else, it's a cautionary tale about what unfolds when sports media's most powerful figure decides another's place at the table must be eliminated. Now let's turn back the clock, because this fire didn't ignite in 2026. Its embers started glowing years earlier, when Kendrick Perkins, a newly retired NBA champion, was navigating his new life beyond the hardwood. Back in 2019, Perkins came aboard ESPN as a basketball analyst. Initially, everything seemed perfect. More than perfect. Perkins was driven, he was ready. He came to work every day, prepared to grind, determined to prove he belonged on that screen just as much as any other athlete who had traded a jersey for a microphone. But an obstacle stood in his way, and that obstacle had a name. You see, upon his arrival at ESPN, Perkins wasn't earning the kind of salary one might associate with a national television figure. He was on what's known in the business as a day rate contract. That arrangement meant he was paid about $2,500 per show, with a firm ceiling on his number of workdays each month. So while America saw Kendrick Perkins on the First Take set appearing as a core member of the cast, the reality backstage was starkly different. He was essentially treated like a temp, brought in when needed and dismissed when not earning just enough to make the travel worthwhile. This is where the plot thickens. And this is where Stephen A. Smith's role in the story takes a turn that has remained hidden until now. It was sometime in 2020, perhaps early 2021, as the NBA playoffs were gaining momentum. And Stephen A. Smith, already the undisputed king of ESPN, the network's highest-earning talent, the man whose words could shape narratives and forge careers, wanted Perkins on First Take for an entire week. Not for a single appearance, not for two, but for the full 5-day stretch. And when Smith pitched this to the ESPN brass, do you know their response? They refused. They informed Stephen A. Smith, the man who was on his way to inking a $100 million deal, that Kendrick Perkins was barred from appearing for a full week due to his contractual restrictions. His day rate agreement had a strict cap, and the corporate machine at ESPN refused to bend its own rules, not even for its marquee personality. But Stephen A. Smith wouldn't accept that. And this is the part of the tale Perkins himself told on the Straight Game podcast. It's the part that for years led everyone to believe Smith was a true ally in Perkins's corner. Because Smith's next move was to get on the phone with the executives, and in no uncertain terms, he ordered them to resolve the issue. According to Perkins, Smith then told him something that would change the entire arc of his career. Smith simply said, "The bosses will call you tomorrow." And just as he predicted the following day, ESPN presented Perkins with a stunning offer. They didn't just tweak his existing deal. They didn't just tack on a few extra appearances. No, they completely shredded his old contract, which still had a year remaining, and replaced it with a massive new 3-year deal worth around $700,000 per year. In the blink of an eye, Kendrick Perkins went from making $2,500 a day with zero job security to being a full-time salaried ESPN analyst, earning close to $750,000 annually. And who orchestrated it all? Stephen A. Smith. Now, if you're taking all this in for the first time, your reaction is likely what everyone else's was when the story first broke. You're likely thinking that Stephen A. Smith did Kendrick Perkins a colossal favor. It looks like a classic case of one friend helping another. It appears to be the most powerful figure at ESPN, wielding his immense power for good. For a long time, that's precisely what Perkins thought too. But what Perkins was unaware of then, what he claims to have discovered only much later, is that Stephen A. Smith's motives were far from altruistic. Because as Perkins has now revealed, that contract upgrade was never an act of camaraderie. It was a strategic maneuver. And Kendrick Perkins was the pawn. Consider the timing. In 2020, Stephen A. Smith was deep in negotiations for what would become his landmark contract with ESPN. He was already working to cement his role as not just the star of First Take, but as the show's unofficial creative commander. He demanded authority over who sat in the opposite chair. He wanted to dictate who would spar with him on television and, more critically, the terms of that engagement. And in Kendrick Perkins, a large, outspoken, and sometimes raw former player who could stir up controversy, but whom Smith was confident he could always dominate. In a debate, he saw the ideal adversary. That contract Stephen A. Smith secured for Kendrick Perkins was never about loyalty or family. Nor was it a reward for Perkins being the network's sharpest analyst. It was a power play, plain and simple. A way to lock in a sparring partner Smith knew he could dominate. Perkins was a man whose entire ESPN career was a product of Smith's influence. He was an asset, a colleague who, when the chips were down, would always be in debt to the man who put him on the map. And for years, the arrangement worked perfectly. Perkins came to work, he fought, he debated, and he fulfilled his role in the spectacle, all, while Stephen A. Smith directed the entire show from center stage, a puppet master in an arena of his own creation. But then the unthinkable happened. Kendrick Perkins cut his strings. He began challenging Smith's narratives, his pushback suddenly feeling less like performance and more like a genuine personal affront. Only this time Smith wasn't making calls to prop Perkins up. He was making calls to take him out, revealing the first fractures in his carefully constructed empire. To truly grasp why Stephen A. Smith would ultimately turn on the man he helped build, you have to look closer. You have to examine the slow decay of their relationship broadcast live for the world to see over several years. This wasn't a clean break. It was a painful, grinding war of attrition fought through a series of on-air battles that devolved from spirited arguments into bitter personal crusades. Every confrontation was another chisel chipping away at the foundation of professional respect that once bound them together. And it all ignited as so many firestorms in the NBA media do, with a heated discussion about race on the set of First Take in February of 2023. Kendrick Perkins sat beside Stephen A. Smith and J.J. Redick, the former NBA sharpshooter turned one of ESPN's most credible voices. They were all there to break down the NBA MVP race. And in that moment, Perkins launched a take so incendiary it threatened to burn the entire production to the ground. Perkins laid out his case. A deep-seated racial bias was skewing MVP voting, and he claimed the numbers proved it, noting that since 1980, only 3 MVPs from outside a top 10 seed had been white. He named Nikola Jokic, who won twice, and Dirk Nowitzki, who won once, arguing this was no mere statistical anomaly, but a clear pattern of prejudice. It was a daring, explosive accusation, the kind of television moment that sends producers into a simultaneous state of terror and exhilaration, knowing the internet was about to catch fire. And catch fire it did, just not in the way Perkins had anticipated, because right next to him sat J.J. Redick. And Redick wasn't just disagreeing. He was disgusted, launching into what would become one of the most legendary confrontations in the show's history. It really is. But what we've just witnessed is the problem with this show, where we create narratives that do not exist in reality. But Redick was far from finished. This was more than just a debate over analytics. He believed his colleague had just leveled a deeply insulting accusation against an entire swath of the basketball world, the voters, the media, and the community itself. The implication, what you are implying, that the white voters that vote on NBA are racist, that are they favor white people. The air on set turned electric, so heavy with hostility you could feel it crackle. Redick's voice trembled not with fear, but with pure, unadulterated rage. And Perkins, refusing to yield, stood his ground. You just said that. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. That is exactly what you implied, Kendrick Perkins. That is exactly what you implied. Redick was so incensed he even called him Spencer Perkins by mistake. That's the moment a professional debate crosses the line and becomes a personal war. Perkins, feeling cornered, fired back like the competitor he was. "I did not call. I stated the facts. I stated the facts. And you're not about to sit on. We all know what you..." The fallout from the segment was immediate and catastrophic. Social media erupted and Reddit forums went into meltdown. And through it all, where was Stephen A. Smith? Reports claim he remained utterly silent. He let Perkins and Reddick savage each other, watching the carnage unfold from his throne like an emperor at the Colosseum. Smith did eventually comment on the blow-up during an appearance on the Bill Simmons podcast, admitting the situation had spiraled. He confessed, and these are his own words. First of all, it can go too far. Secondly, in that particular show, it did go too far. I thought both of them were wrong to a certain degree. It did get uncomfortable. But according to Perkins, what truly stung wasn't what was said during the argument. It was not about the heated exchange. Perkins had spent his life in the trenches of high-pressure conflict. He was an NBA veteran of over a decade, a champion with the Boston Celtics. He had battled against the most formidable athletes on the biggest stages in sports. A shouting match on television wasn't going to break him. No, what wounded Perkins was what happened when the broadcast ended and the cameras went dark. He claims Stephen A. Smith never pulled him aside to offer support, never said, "That was insane, but I have your back," and never even bothered to call him later that night. Instead, Perkins alleges that Smith took that exact confrontation, that volatile moment with J.J. Redick, and weaponized it behind the scenes. He reportedly used it as proof that Perkins was an unpredictable risk, a loose cannon who couldn't be trusted on live TV without causing a corporate nightmare. And this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a recurring theme, with Smith allegedly using Perkins's on-air fights as ammunition against him in the halls of power again and again. On camera, the clashes between Perkins and Smith were electric, whether they were sparring over LeBron versus Jordan or dissecting MVP races. The two would go to war over which conference, the East or the West, truly commanded respect in the league. But once the cameras stopped rolling, Smith would allegedly walk straight to the network executives and portray Perkins as the source of the friction. The tipping point came during the Christmas Day schedule debate in August of 2025. The NBA had just unveiled its holiday slate, and it was overwhelmingly dominated by the Western Conference. A staggering 4 out of the 5 matchups featured teams from the West, with only the Cleveland Cavaliers and New York Knicks holding it down for the East. Stephen A. Smith immediately branded it as a blatant show of disrespect to the Eastern Conference and to Perkins. In response, Perkins took to his road trip and podcast to methodically dismantle Smith's entire argument. Perkins's take was direct, and it was powerful. He argued that the Western Conference was where the real star power was concentrated. Anthony Edwards, Nikola Jokic, Shai Gilgeous Alexander, LeBron James, Stephen Curry, Kevin Durant, and Cooper Flagg. He insisted the NBA was simply making a sharp business decision by showcasing its biggest attractions on its most important day. This was especially crucial, he noted, since basketball was in a direct ratings battle with the NFL on Christmas. And Perkins was brutally honest. He flat out said, "This league is still run by the OGs, KD, Steph, and LeBron. Who do you think is playing on the NBA's opening night? KD, Steph, LeBron, and the champs for their ring ceremony. And who's playing on Christmas? KD, Steph, and LeBron." He didn't stop there. He broke down the competitive realities with a depth that made Smith's initial complaints seem completely hollow in contrast. He explained, "You've got 2 sports competing on Christmas Day. You've got football, and we know football is king. We all get that. But then you have basketball. So to capture the audience you need, where do you find the biggest superstars in the sport? They're all playing in the Western Conference." To the casual viewer, this was nothing more than 2 analysts having a routine disagreement about scheduling the kind of debate that fills sports media every single day. But lurking beneath that surface, Perkins claims was another calculated move by Smith to use their on-air dispute as a weapon against him. According to Perkins, Smith despised being publicly challenged, especially by someone whose career at ESPN was launched by a phone call that Smith himself had initiated years before. This dynamic brings us to what may be the most damning incident of them all the time. Stephen A. Smith unloaded one of his famous rants. But this rant wasn't aimed at a basketball player, a team, or a franchise. It was aimed directly at Kendrick Perkins. The clip went viral instantly. Smith, visibly enraged, sat on the first take set and tore into Perkins with a ferocity that felt deeply personal, not professional. From a pure basketball perspective, I don't necessarily disagree with Perk, but he is seriously annoying me today. And let me tell you why Perkins is annoying me. And pay close attention to what Smith said. He didn't challenge Perkins's analysis of the game. He never said that Perkins was factually incorrect. He said Perkins was annoying him. The debate was no longer about basketball. This was now a personal attack. Smith's voice rose with fury as he continued, because this is a man who is a champion. You're talking about a Game 7 and he's talking about a Game 7 like, oh, you know what, Cat's just going to step up. And then Smith went for the kill. He brought up the one painful moment in Perkins's career that every NBA follower knows, the injury that kept him off the court for the biggest game of his life. And he knows this because he is a champion. And not only that, when they lost in Game 7, you were injured. You didn't play. That right there, Perkins says, was the moment that crossed a sacred line. Because to mention his 2010 NBA Finals injury, the knee injury that prevented him from playing in Game 7 against the Lakers, a game the Celtics would go on to lose. A loss that torments Perkins even now. That wasn't debate. That wasn't analysis. That was a knife to the gut. And Stephen A. Smith was twisting it for a national audience. Had you played, you might have beaten the Lakers. It's a big deal. It's a game. The insinuation was unmistakable. Smith was saying, you aren't fit to speak on Game 7 pressure because you weren't even there for the biggest Game 7 of your own career. And while Malika Andrews attempted to intervene and de-escalate, can I defend your honor? I don't think we have time. Just because you yell something doesn't make it true. The attack had already landed. The internet had its soundbite. The story was written. And privately, according to Perkins, Stephen A. Smith was using moments precisely like this to argue to ESPN management that Kendrick Perkins was more of a liability than an asset. But the Charles Barkley incident in March of 2025 may be the clearest illustration of the double standard Perkins says he faced at ESPN. When Barkley went on TNT's Inside the NBA, labeling Perkins an idiot and a fool for his takes on the Lakers, Perkins shot back on X with his signature intensity, challenging Barkley to repeat the insults to his face. At that moment, Stephen A. Smith publicly defended Perkins, posting on X, "Yo Chuck, stop the BS with the yawl. Attach a name to it." It looked like a supportive move, a colleague watching your back. But Perkins claims that behind the scenes, a completely different narrative was being spun. To the public, he was the loyal mentor. But behind the scenes, Perkins alleged that Smith was telling ESPN's top brass that the Barkley situation proved Perkins was a public relations liability for the company. The argument Smith was making, as Perkins described it, was brutally effective. This man is a magnet for conflict. He picks fights on our own set, on podcasts, across social media, even with personalities from rival networks. It was only a matter of time before he became more trouble than he was worth. And in a final bitter twist of fate, by the time Perkins and Barkley had settled their differences in June 2025, after Michael Wilbon brokered a peace talk, with Barkley even offering to sit down for a meal during the NBA Finals, the insidious work at ESPN was complete. The toxic narrative Smith had allegedly spun to the executives had metastasized, and Perkins was about to discover its devastating reach, all because of one last public flare-up. This incident gave Stephen A. Smith the perfect weapon he needed, and it centered on something far from the basketball court, a mobile app known as Papaya Gaming. In November of 2025, a directive came down from ESPN ordering its on-air personalities, Perkins among them, to sever all connections with the controversial gaming application, citing a clear conflict of interest and demanding immediate compliance. But what truly infuriated Perkins was the glaring hypocrisy. Stephen A. Smith had also been a promoter for the app, yet, as the story goes, Smith was never held to the same standard. There was no public reprimand, no demand to cut ties, absolute silence. As Perkins saw it, the hierarchy could not have been more obvious. One set of rules applied to Stephen A. Smith, and an entirely different set applied to everybody else. For Kendrick Perkins, a man whose very presence at ESPN was credited to Smith's endorsement, challenging that hierarchy meant putting his entire career on the line. The end felt near. By February of 2026, the message was unmistakable, and Kendrick Perkins saw it in bold letters. The whispers had been growing louder for weeks. Clickbait YouTube thumbnails exploded across the platform, all claiming Perkins was officially out at ESP. following another clash with Stephen A. Smith. Parody accounts on X expertly mimicking famed insiders like Shams Charania and Adrian Wojnarowski spread counterfeit breaking news, lending the rumors a veneer of credibility. And on Reddit, deep within the NBA subforums and across the comment sections of every sports site imaginable, the debate raged, was this the end of the road for Perkins at ESPN? The constant chatter was overwhelming, and for the first time Perkins felt the story spiraling beyond his grasp. But people often misjudge the man from Beaumont, Texas. In the 409, as he proudly calls it, you're taught from a young age that you don't back down from a confrontation. You charge straight into it. And that is precisely what Perkins chose to do. He went on television. He stared directly into the camera lens, armed with the serene resolve of a man who has accepted any and all consequences. Then Kendrick Perkins uttered the sentence that sent a seismic shock through the sports media landscape. If ESPN let me go today, I wouldn't lose a wink of sleep. You want to know why? Because some team in Boston would sign me tomorrow. The clip became an instant phenomenon. It wasn't merely the words that carried such weight, it was the powerful subtext. Perkins wasn't just boasting about his career prospects or leveraging his ties to Boston, the city where he became a champion and a beloved figure. This was a targeted strike. That message had a specific audience of one Stephen A. Smith. In the coded language of corporate warfare, a language understood only by those who have survived it. Perkins's true statement was this: "You have no power over me. You believe you launched my media career. You believe that one phone call back in 2020 gives you the authority to dictate when it's over. You are sorely mistaken, because I had a name before I met you, and I'll have one long after you're gone. And if this company decides to show me the door because of your backroom politics, I will exit this place with my dignity intact as my phone rings with offers from everyone else." The reaction across social media was immediate and explosive. He was mocked by some, celebrated by others. A faction of fans dismissed him as just another ex-player who should have been let go years ago. Yet what no one could dispute, not the critics, not the doubters, and not even Stephen A. Smith himself, was that Kendrick Perkins had just committed an act of defiance rarely seen within the walls of ESPN. He spoke his truth, and that truth, as Perkins would continue to reveal over the next several days and weeks, was absolutely devastating. Because Perkins didn't just make one defiant stand and then retreat into silence. He continued his offensive on podcasts and across his social channels. In interview after interview, he meticulously exposed what he framed as a deeply rooted system of manipulation, cronyism, and political maneuvering that he claimed was the cornerstone of Stephen A. Smith's power at ESPN. Perkins detailed how Smith wielded his enormous influence to dictate not only the guest list on First Take, but also the narratives they were permitted to discuss. He described a pattern where Smith would privately undermine colleagues with management while feigning support in public. He laid out the Papaya Gaming double standard, where he and others were disciplined for the same endorsement that brought Smith no apparent penalty. And he explained how the very contract that Smith had championed for him in 2020 had transformed from an opportunity into a collar. From ESPN, the response was a wall of predictable corporate silence. The network released no official statement, offering no confirmation or denial of the explosive claims. Their strategy was to simply wait for the storm to pass, hoping the next major sports controversy would sweep this one from the headlines. But what the network failed to account for was the court of public opinion, where the evidence of the Smith-Perkins feud, the evidence of the betrayal, was scattered in plain sight, hidden across years of television segments, social media clashes, and podcast confessions. But when pieced together, when the timeline of their public friendship is laid over the timeline of the private sabotage, Perkins described a chilling picture of manipulation takes form. It began in 2020 when Smith helped land Perkins a $700,000 a year deal. In 2023, Smith stood by as an explosive on-air debate over race nearly brought Perkins and JJ Redick to physical blows, only to allegedly use that very incident as a weapon against Perkins behind the scenes. By 2025, the deception was in full motion, with Smith publicly backing Perkins during his feud with Barkley, while, according to Perkins, simultaneously branding him a liability to the network's top executives. And by February of 2026, the final phase of the plan was underway. As Perkins tells it, the strategy was a masterclass in betrayal. Elevate someone to the point where they owe you everything. Then the instant they are no longer useful, the moment they begin to think for themselves or challenge you in ways you haven't approved, you begin the systematic teardown. But not out in the open, never in public. That would damage your own brand. No, the assassination is quiet, carried out in corporate meetings. It's executed with poisonous whispers and strategic suggestions, planting seeds of doubt in the ears of the people who control the money. And the most terrifying part of it all is that it almost succeeded. Because by the middle of February 2026, the rumor mill was churning at full speed. Fans were certain Perkins was fired. Major media outlets were already publishing stories on his dramatic exit from ESPN, and Stephen A. Smith, Perkins alleges, was simply leaning back, enjoying the spectacle he had orchestrated, even appearing to taunt Perkins on television as the drama unfolded, treating one man's career as cheap entertainment. But there was one thing Stephen A. Smith apparently failed to anticipate. He didn't anticipate ESPN's own official press website continuing to list Perkins as a current NBA analyst. He didn't anticipate Perkins being named a member of the newly formed NBA Countdown cast, sharing the desk with Malika Andrews, Brian Windhorst, and Michael Malone. And he certainly didn't anticipate that the same executives he had been whispering to had seemingly reached their own conclusion that Kendrick Perkins was too valuable to let go. He was kept on not because of Stephen A. Smith, but in spite of him. And this is where the entire narrative collapses in on itself with breathtaking irony. Because while Stephen A. Smith was allegedly maneuvering to have Perkins removed from the network, it was Smith himself who had already bailed on NBA Countdown during his own tense contract negotiations. He even publicly claimed he had no interest in being on the show, saying his schedule was far too demanding. So in the end, the man allegedly trying to get Perkins thrown off the show was the one who was gone. And Perkins was the one who got to stay. The irony is almost too perfect to be real. But maybe the single most impactful thing Kendrick Perkins did amidst this firestorm wasn't a viral soundbite. It wasn't a shocking podcast tell-all. It wasn't a defiant post on social media or a heated on-air confrontation. The most powerful thing Perkins did was refuse to become what Stephen A. Smith allegedly wanted him to be. Another warning to anyone who dared to step out of line. Because the sports media landscape is a graveyard of careers filled with analysts and commentators who were chewed up and spit out by the industry machine people who made an enemy of the wrong person. They crossed a line they shouldn't have or dared to voice an opinion that wasn't approved by the most powerful man in the building. And nearly all of those people simply vanished. They fade into obscurity, replaced by the next hot take machine, the next former athlete willing to take a seat, smile and dutifully agree with everything Stephen A. Smith says. Kendrick Perkins refused to be another ghost. He stood firm. He spoke his truth. And in doing so, he forced a conversation that ESPN has reportedly been desperate to avoid for years. It was a conversation about power, about who gets protected, and about what happens when one single talent at a network grows so big they can create or destroy careers with one phone call. The same call that could grant Perkins a $700,000 contract could in theory just as easily take it all away. And that, more than anything, is what Perkins says terrified him. It wasn't about losing the money or losing the fame. It was the crushing realization that his entire career at the network was built on ground controlled by someone who he felt was never really on his side. As of this moment, Kendrick Perkins is still an analyst at ESPN. His profile is still live on the official ESPN press website. The reports of his termination were completely debunked despite a tidal wave of clickbait articles and parody accounts that treated his firing as a fact. And Stephen A. Smith. He is still the undisputed king of ESPN. Still the network's highest paid personality. Still the man whose takes can dominate the entire sports conversation. But the ground has shifted beneath his throne, because now the audience knows. The fans know the millions who tune into First Take every single morning now know that the battle they see on their screens might be a pale imitation of the war being fought when the cameras are off. And that new awareness that knowledge is something Stephen A. Smith cannot out-yell, cannot out-debate, and cannot spin away. Kendrick Perkins didn't just withstand Stephen A. Smith's alleged shadow campaign against him. He exposed it for the world to see. And by doing that, he pulled back the curtain on a secret the sports media industry has guarded for decades. That the most brutal fights in sports television aren't waged on the hardwood or inside a ring. They're fought in corporate offices, in executive suites, and on private phone calls between men so powerful they can decide a person's entire future before they've finished their coffee. And the next time you watch Kendrick Perkins and Stephen A. Smith sitting face to face on national television, arguing about LeBron James or the MVP race, ask yourself a simple question. Is what you're watching real? Or is it just one more performance in a game that was rigged long before the broadcast ever began? Because Kendrick Perkins believes he knows the answer. And now you do too. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to explore our other incredible content on the channel. We appreciate you watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.